The autumn rain pelted against the tall windows of Windsor Castle, creating rivulets that distorted the view of the sprawling gardens beyond. Inside the grand drawing room, three figures sat in a silence that had stretched far too long. Princess Anne, known throughout the kingdom for her unwavering composure and steely determination, sat rigidly in her chair, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. Across from her, King Charles III gazed out at the storm, his face bearing the weight of recent months that had aged him beyond his years. Between them, Catherine, the Princess of Wales, sat quietly, her usual warm demeanor subdued by the gravity of the conversation that was about to unfold. The clock on a mantelpiece ticked with mechanical precision, marking each second that passed in the uncomfortable quiet. Anne's eyes remained fixed on her brother, studying the man who had once been simply Charlie to her, the boy who had chased her through these very halls decades ago. Now he wore the crown that had changed everything, not just for him, but for their entire family. The burden of kingship had settled on his shoulders like a heavy cloak, one that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Catherine shifted slightly in her seat, her wedding ring catching the dim light filtering through the rain-soaked windows. She had requested this meeting, knowing it would be difficult, knowing it might change the delicate balance of relationships within the royal family forever. But some truths she had come to realize could no longer remain buried beneath layers of protocol and polite silence. The recent months had tested them all in ways none of them had anticipated when Charles had first taken the throne. Anne's breathing had become shallow, though she fought to maintain her composed exterior. She had always prided herself on being the practical one, the princess who rolled up her sleeves and got on with the work without complaint or drama. She had weathered scandals, personal heartbreaks, and public scrutiny with a dignity that had earned her respect even from those who might have criticized other members of the royal family. But today, sitting in this room with these two people who meant more to her than she had ever allowed herself to admit, she felt vulnerable in a way that was entirely foreign to her. The conversation had begun innocuously enough, with discussions about upcoming engagements and charitable commitments. Charles had mentioned the strain he was feeling, the weight of public expectations, and the loneliness that seemed to follow him even in crowded rooms. Catherine had listened with the patience she had cultivated over years of royal life, offering gentle words of support and understanding. And had remained largely silent, her sharp intelligence taking in every nuance of what was being said and, more importantly, what was being left unsaid. It was Catherine who had first broached the subject that hung between them like a heavy curtain. She had spoken carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone who understood that every syllable carried weight in this rarefied world they inhabited. She had talked about family, about the importance of honesty within their small circle, about the need to address things that had been allowed to fester in silence for too long. Charles had turned from the window then, his eyes meeting Catherine's with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. He had always appreciated her directness, her ability to cut through the elaborate dance of royal communication to reach the heart of matters. But he also knew that once certain words were spoken, they could never be taken back. The royal family had survived for centuries partly through its ability to maintain elegant silences about uncomfortable truths. Anne's composure began to crack when Charles started to speak about their father. Prince Philip had been gone for several years now, but his presence still lingered in every corner of the castle, in every family gathering, in the expectations and traditions he had helped to shape. Charles spoke haltingly about regrets, about words left unsaid, and opportunities missed. He talked about the pressure their father had placed on him to be perfect, to never show weakness, to always put duty before personal happiness. Catherine watched Anne's face as Charles continued, seeing the careful mask beginning to slip. She had come to know, and well over the years, had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when the princess was struggling. Most people saw only Anne's public face, the no-nonsense royal who could handle any crisis with apparent ease. But Catherine had witnessed the private moments, the times when Anne's guard dropped and revealed the deeply feeling woman beneath the practical exterior. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the windows with increasing urgency. Inside the drawing room, Charles's voice grew quieter as he began to address the specific reason Catherine had requested this meeting. There were things that needed to be said about Anne's role in the family, about sacrifices she had made that had gone unacknowledged, about the way she had always put the institution ahead of her own needs and desires. Anne's breathing became more labored as her brother continued. She had never expected to hear these words from him, had never imagined that he truly understood the price she had paid for her unwavering loyalty. For decades, she had been the reliable one, the princess who never complained, never caused scandals, never demanded attention or special treatment. She had watched as other family members made headlines for all the wrong reasons, while she quietly continued her work, supporting hundreds of charities and organizations with little fanfare or recognition. Catherine leaned forward slightly, her heart aching as she watched and struggled to maintain her composure. She had grown to love this complicated woman who showed her affection through actions rather than words, who had welcomed her into the family with a gruff kindness that had meant more than any flowery speeches, and had been one of the first family members to truly accept Catherine, recognizing in her the same practical dedication to duty that in herself embodied. The moment that would change everything was approaching, though none of them fully realized it yet. Charles was building toward something, working up the courage to express feelings and acknowledgments that had been years in the making. Catherine could sense the importance of what was coming, could feel the electric tension in the air that preceded moments of profound emotional significance. Anne's hands had begun to tremble slightly, though she fought to control the physical manifestation of her inner turmoil. She had always been the strong one, the sister who could be counted on to handle whatever crisis arose. She had supported Charles through his difficult divorce, had stood by William and Harry during their turbulent teenage years, had been a steady presence in times of scandal and uncertainty. But now, faced with the possibility of being truly seen and acknowledged for those sacrifices, she found herself more vulnerable than she had been in decades. The fire in the fireplace crackled softly, providing the only sound beyond the rain and the ticking clock. The three of them sat in this bubble of suspended time, each aware that they were on the precipice of something significant. Catherine had orchestrated this moment carefully, knowing that both Charles and needed to have this conversation, but would never initiate it themselves. Both siblings were too proud, too accustomed to swallowing their emotions in service of their roles. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating. The weather seemed to mirror the emotional tempest brewing within the drawing room, as if nature itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. The ancient walls of Windsor Castle had witnessed countless family dramas over the centuries, had absorbed the tears and joys and heartbreaks of generations of royals. Today, they would bear witness to another moment of profound human connection. Charles took a deep breath, his voice catching slightly as he began to speak the words that Catherine had gently encouraged him to express. He talked about watching and throughout their childhood, seeing how she had always been expected to be strong, how she had never been allowed the luxury of weakness or uncertainty that had sometimes been afforded to him as the heir. He spoke about her intelligence, her humor, her fierce protective instincts when it came to family and duty. Anne's carefully constructed walls began to crumble as her brother continued. She thought about their mother, Queen Elizabeth II, and had always strived to live up to her example of selfless service. She remembered countless moments throughout their lives when she had chosen duty over personal happiness, when she had put the needs of the monarchy ahead of her own desires and dreams. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to acknowledge the loneliness that had been her constant companion. Catherine watched this unprecedented display of vulnerability from and with a mixture of sadness and hope. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, the unique pressures faced by the women in this family. She had experienced her own moments of doubt and loneliness, times when the weight of public expectation felt almost unbearable. But she had also learned the power of connection, of allowing others to see beyond the public persona to the real person underneath. The conversation was building toward its crescendo, though, and still had no idea what Catherine was planning to say. The Princess of Wales had been carefully observing both siblings, waiting for the right moment to speak the words that had been weighing on her heart for months. She understood the deep love that existed between Charles and, even though it had rarely been expressed openly. She also understood that sometimes people needed permission to show their vulnerability, needed someone else to speak the truths they couldn't bring themselves to voice. The drawing room felt smaller somehow, as if the intensity of the emotions being shared had compressed the space around them. The formal furniture and royal portraits seemed to fade into the background, leaving only three people struggling to navigate the complex terrain of family love and duty. This was no longer about protocol or royal obligations. This had become something much more fundamental and human. Anne's composure finally began to shatter completely as Charles reached the point in his monologue where he began to express his deep appreciation for everything she had done for their family. The words he spoke were ones she had never expected to hear, acknowledgments of sacrifices she had made in silence, recognition of the strength she had shown during the family's darkest hours. For someone who had spent her life deflecting praise and avoiding emotional displays, hearing these words from her brother was almost overwhelming. The stage was now perfectly set for Catherine's intervention. The emotional groundwork had been laid, the defenses had been lowered, and both siblings were more open and vulnerable than they had been in years. Catherine could sense that this was her moment, the perfect time to speak the words that would bring this long-overdue conversation to its emotional climax. She took a breath and prepared to whisper the single line that would change everything in that room. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, as if the very heavens were acknowledging the significance of what was about to unfold within the walls of Windsor Castle. Catherine drew in a breath so quietly that neither Charles nor Anne noticed the subtle preparation. The Princess of Wales had always possessed an intuitive understanding of human nature, a quality that had served her well during her years in the royal spotlight. She could read the emotional undercurrents in a room with remarkable accuracy, and, right now, she could see that both siblings were balanced on the edge of something profound. Charles had opened his heart in a way that was rare for him, speaking with unprecedented honesty about his appreciation for Anne's sacrifices, and, meanwhile, was visibly struggling to maintain the composure that had been her armor for so many years. The words Catherine was about to speak had been forming in her mind for weeks. She had witnessed countless interactions between the royal siblings, had seen the love and respect that flowed between them despite their carefully maintained emotional distance. As someone who had married into this complex family dynamic, she had a unique perspective on the relationships that had been shaped by duty, tradition, and the peculiar pressures of royal life. She understood that sometimes an outsider's voice was needed to speak truths that family members couldn't express to each other directly. Catherine's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, yet it carried the weight of absolute conviction. She has always been the one who loves you most unconditionally, Charles, but she has never felt safe enough to show it. The words hung in the air like a bell that had been struck, their resonance filling every corner of the drawing room. The simple sentence contained layers of meaning that both Charles and immediately understood, cutting through decades of royal protocol to reach the heart of their relationship. The effect was instantaneous and devastating in its completeness. Anne's carefully constructed facade didn't crack gradually. It shattered all at once, like glass struck by a hammer. The sob that escaped her lips was raw and primal, containing years of suppressed emotion that had finally found its release. Her hands flew to cover her face as tears began streaming down her cheeks, the physical manifestation of an emotional dam that had finally burst after decades of careful maintenance. Charles turned sharply toward his sister, his own eyes immediately filling with tears as he witnessed Anne's breakdown. In all their years together, through family crises and personal tragedies, he had rarely seen Anne cry. She had been a pillar of strength during their mother's final years, had supported him through the difficult transition to kingship, had weathered her own personal storms with a dignity that had often left him in awe. Seeing her now, vulnerable and broken open by Catherine's gentle words, was both heartbreaking and profoundly moving. The transformation in the room was palpable. Where moments before there had been formal distance maintained by years of royal training, now there was raw human emotion flowing freely. Catherine watched as Charles immediately moved toward Anne, his own composure forgotten in the face of his sister's pain. The barriers that had kept them at arm's length for so many years seemed to dissolve in an instant, replaced by the simple need of one sibling to comfort another. Anne's tears came in waves, each one carrying with it the weight of unspoken words and unexpressed feelings. She thought about all the times she had wanted to tell Charles how proud she was of him, how much she admired his dedication to his role despite the personal cost. She remembered moments from their childhood when she had felt fiercely protective of her older brother, times when she had wanted to shield him from criticism or disappointment, but hadn't known how to express those feelings within the constraints of their formal upbringing. Catherine's words had unlocked something fundamental in Anne's emotional landscape. The phrase about feeling safe enough had struck directly at the heart of her experience as a royal woman. Safety, in their world, often meant maintaining distance, avoiding vulnerability, and never giving critics or the media ammunition to use against the family, and had learned early in life that showing too much emotion or need could be seen as weakness, something that could be exploited or used to damage the institution they all served. Charles knelt beside his sister's chair, his formal bearing completely abandoned as he reached for her hands. And he said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "I had no idea. I never realized." His words were halting, imperfect, but they carried a sincerity that resonated through the room. For the first time in years, he wasn't speaking as a king to his subject, but as a brother to his sister, offering comfort in the most basic and human way possible. The physical contact between the siblings was remarkable in its rarity. Royal training had taught them both to maintain appropriate distance, to express affection through formal gestures and careful words rather than spontaneous physical comfort. But now, with Anne's defenses completely down and Charles's natural protective instincts fully engaged, such considerations seemed irrelevant and almost ridiculous. Catherine remained quietly in her chair, recognizing that her role in this moment was to bear witness rather than to participate directly. She had provided the catalyst for this emotional breakthrough, but what was happening now needed to unfold between Charles and without interference. She watched as years of careful royal reserve melted away, replaced by something much more fundamental and real. Anne's sobs gradually began to subside, but the tears continued to flow freely down her cheeks. She looked up at her brother, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time in years. Not as the king, not as the heir who had always carried the weight of expectation, but as Charles, the boy she had grown up with and protected and loved fiercely, but silently. "I never wanted to burden you," she managed to say through her tears. "You already had so much pressure, so many demands. I thought if I could just be strong enough, reliable enough, you wouldn't have to worry about me too." The admission hit Charles like a physical blow. He realized with stunning clarity how his sister had shaped her entire life around supporting him and the institution he represented. While he had been focused on preparing for kingship, dealing with his own personal struggles and public scrutiny, and had been quietly sacrificing her own emotional needs to ensure that she never added to his burden. The selflessness of it was overwhelming, and he felt a surge of love and protectiveness that caught him completely off guard. Catherine watched as understanding dawned in Charles's eyes. She could see him processing the full implications of Anne's words, recognizing patterns of behavior that suddenly made perfect sense when viewed through this new lens. Anne's famous work ethic, her reluctance to ask for help or attention, her tendency to deflect praise and minimize her own accomplishments, all of it had been motivated by a deep love for her brother and a desire to make his impossible job just a little bit easier. The rain outside had intensified into a proper storm, with wind howling around the ancient stones of Windsor Castle. But inside the drawing room, a different kind of storm was subsiding, leaving in its wake a new understanding between the siblings. Charles found himself remembering moments from their shared past with fresh perspective, seeing Anne's actions and choices in a completely different light. He thought about their father's funeral, when Anne had been a tower of strength for the entire family while dealing with her own profound grief. He remembered the early days of his kingship, when she had quietly increased her own workload to help cover royal engagements he couldn't attend. He recalled countless family crises over the years when Anne had been the one to step forward and handle difficult situations with minimal fuss or recognition. "You have been carrying everyone else's emotional weight," Catherine said softly, her voice barely audible above the storm outside. She was speaking to but her words were meant for both siblings. "For so long, you've been the one who absorbs the stress and anxiety so others don't have to feel it. But who has been carrying yours?" The question hung in the air between them, its answer painfully obvious, and had been carrying her own emotional weight alone, just as she carried everyone else's. The isolation of that realization was staggering, and Charles felt a rush of guilt and remorse that threatened to overwhelm him. How had he been so blind to his sister's needs? How had he allowed her to sacrifice so much while giving so little in return? And wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so uncharacteristically vulnerable that it made Catherine's own eyes fill with tears. "I don't know how to be anything else," Anne admitted quietly. "I don't know how to need things from other people. I don't know how to be weak or uncertain or ask for help. It feels dangerous, like everything might fall apart if I'm not holding it together." The confession was devastating in its honesty. Charles could hear in his sister's words the echo of their royal upbringing, the implicit lessons they had both learned about duty and service and the suppression of personal needs for the greater good. But he could also hear something else, a deep exhaustion that came from carrying impossible burdens for far too long. Catherine leaned forward in her chair, her heart breaking for this woman who had given so much of herself to others that she had almost forgotten she deserved care and support in return. "Showing your needs doesn't make you weak," and she said gently. "It makes you human. And being human is what makes you so good at helping others. People trust you because they can sense your authenticity, even when you're being strong for them." The conversation was entering new territory now, moving beyond the initial emotional breakthrough into something deeper and more transformative. Charles could feel the foundation of their relationship shifting, old patterns and assumptions being replaced by something more honest and sustainable. For the first time in his adult life, he was seeing his sister not as an extension of the royal machine, but as a complete person with her own needs and vulnerabilities. And looked between Catherine and Charles, seeing something in their faces that she had rarely encountered in her 50-plus years of life. Unconditional acceptance of her weakness. Not judgment, not disappointment, not the subtle pressure to pull herself together and get back to work, but simple, loving acceptance of her humanity. It was a gift she had never expected to receive, and one that she hardly knew how to accept. The storm outside reached its peak intensity, lightning illuminating the windows in brilliant flashes that made the drawing room feel like the eye of a hurricane. Inside this small space, three people were navigating their own emotional tempest, working to rebuild relationships that had been constrained by years of royal protocol and unspoken expectations. Charles squeezed Anne's hands gently, a gesture that communicated more than any formal words could convey. For the first time in decades, he felt he was truly seeing his sister, understanding the full scope of her sacrifice and dedication. The weight of that recognition was both humbling and motivating, inspiring him to become the kind of brother and deserved rather than simply the king she had chosen to serve. The transformation that followed Catherine's whispered words was not immediate or dramatic in the way that fairy tales might suggest, but rather a slow, careful rebuilding that began in the moments after Anne's tears had subsided. Charles remained beside his sister's chair, his hand still holding hers, both of them processing the magnitude of what had just been revealed. The drawing room, which had felt so formal and imposing at the beginning of their gathering, now seemed intimate and safe, a sanctuary where truth could be spoken without fear of judgment or consequence. Catherine recognized that her role in this healing process was far from over. While her words had provided the catalyst for this emotional breakthrough, the real work of rebuilding the relationship between Charles and would require careful nurturing and ongoing support. She had seen too many families struggle to maintain emotional honesty after moments of crisis, reverting to old patterns of distance and formality when the immediate intensity faded. She was determined not to let that happen with these two people she had come to love deeply. Anne's breathing gradually returned to normal, though her eyes remained red from crying, and her composure was still fragile. She felt simultaneously drained and liberated, as if the emotional release had left her empty, but also somehow lighter. The weight she had carried for so many years hadn't disappeared entirely, but it no longer felt like hers alone to bear. For the first time in decades, she could imagine sharing that burden with someone else, trusting another person to help support what had always felt like her solitary responsibility. Charles found himself studying his sister's face with new eyes, noticing details he had overlooked for years. The fine lines around her eyes spoke of decades spent squinting against cameras and wind during outdoor engagements. The slight tension in her jaw revealed the effort it had cost her to maintain her composed public face through countless difficult moments. Even her posture, which had always seemed so naturally erect and confident, now appeared to him as evidence of the constant vigilance required to project strength when she might have preferred to show vulnerability. The conversation that followed was unlike any they had ever shared. Without the protective barriers of royal protocol and emotional distance, they began to speak with unprecedented honesty about their experiences, their fears, and their hopes for the future. Charles talked about the loneliness of kingship, the weight of knowing that every decision he made would affect millions of people, the difficulty of maintaining personal relationships when duty constantly demanded priority over individual needs. And, encouraged by Catherine's gentle questions and Charles's obvious receptivity, began to share stories from her own life that she had never told anyone. She spoke about moments of doubt during her royal duties, times when she had questioned whether she was truly making a difference or simply going through the motions of an elaborate performance. She described the peculiar isolation of being simultaneously one of the most recognized women in the country and one of the loneliest, surrounded by people who knew her public role but had never been allowed to see her private self. Catherine listened to both siblings with the patience of someone who understood the courage it required for them to be so open. She had experienced her own version of royal loneliness, the strange disconnect between public adoration and private uncertainty that seemed to be an inevitable part of life in their rarefied world. But she had also learned, through her relationship with William and her growing connections with other family members, that authentic intimacy was possible even within the constraints of royal life. As the afternoon wore on and the storm outside gradually subsided, the three of them began to envision what their relationships might look like moving forward. Charles expressed his desire to be not just a king who appreciated in service, but a brother who actively supported her emotional well-being. He talked about wanting to create space in their formal interactions for more personal connection, moments when they could step away from their official roles and simply be siblings who cared about each other. and, still somewhat overwhelmed by the new territory they were exploring, admitted that she wasn't entirely sure how to accept the kind of support Charles was offering. Decades of self-reliance and emotional independence had made vulnerability feel foreign and somewhat dangerous. But she was willing to try, motivated by the profound relief she had felt when Catherine's words had finally given voice to feelings she had never been able to express herself. Catherine suggested practical ways they might begin to implement this new dynamic in their relationship. She talked about the importance of regular check-ins that went beyond official business, opportunities for and Charles to share their personal experiences and concerns without the pressure of finding immediate solutions. She emphasized that building emotional intimacy would be a gradual process, requiring patience and forgiveness from both sides as they learn to navigate this unfamiliar territory. The discussion expanded beyond just the relationship between Charles and to encompass broader questions about family dynamics within the royal household. Catherine spoke about her hopes for creating an environment where all family members felt safe to express vulnerability, where seeking emotional support was seen as strength rather than weakness. She envisioned family gatherings that included space for genuine conversation alongside formal obligations, relationships built on mutual care rather than simply shared duty, and found herself opening up about her relationships with other family members, particularly her nephews William and Harry. She expressed regret about opportunities she had missed to offer them emotional support during their difficult teenage years, times when she had wanted to reach out but had been unsure how to bridge the gap between her formal role and her personal concern for their well-being. The realization that she could have been a source of comfort rather than simply another authority figure was both painful and motivating. Charles listened to his sister's reflections with growing understanding of how their family's emotional patterns had affected multiple generations. He recognized that the distance and formality that had characterized his own upbringing had been passed down to his sons, creating cycles of isolation that served no one's needs. The prospect of breaking those cycles, of creating healthier patterns of connection and support, felt both daunting and essential. The practical implications of their new understanding began to emerge as they continued talking. Charles committed to scheduling regular private meetings with, and that would be protected from official business, time specifically set aside for them to connect as siblings rather than as monarch and princess. And, despite her lingering uncertainty about accepting support, agreed to be more open about her own needs and struggles rather than constantly focusing on everyone else's well-being. Catherine offered to serve as a bridge between them during the transition period, helping to facilitate conversations and provide perspective when old patterns of distance and formality threatened to reassert themselves. Her outsider status, which had once made her feel uncertain about her place in the family, now seemed like an asset that could help prevent them from reverting to familiar but unhealthy dynamics. As the natural light in the drawing room began to fade, requiring the soft illumination of table lamps to supplement the dying fire, the three of them found themselves discussing broader philosophical questions about duty, service, and personal fulfillment, and spoke about her lifelong struggle to balance her commitment to royal obligation with her own human needs, the way she had often felt guilty for wanting things that seemed selfish or unnecessary when viewed against the larger purpose of their work. Charles shared his own version of this internal conflict, describing how the pressure to be a perfect representative of the monarchy had sometimes left him feeling disconnected from his authentic self. He talked about moments when he had envied people who could express their emotions freely, who could prioritize their personal relationships without considering the public implications of every choice. Catherine contributed her perspective as someone who had chosen to enter this world as an adult, bringing with her experiences of relationships and emotional expression that hadn't been shaped by royal training from birth. She spoke about the culture shock of learning to navigate a world where spontaneous affection had to be carefully moderated, where personal needs were always secondary to institutional requirements. The conversation gradually evolved into something resembling a planning session for their emotional future together. They discussed specific scenarios where their new understanding might be tested, situations where old patterns of distance and formality would be likely to reassert themselves. Charles acknowledged that his instinct during times of crisis had always been to rely on Anne's strength, without considering what she might need from him in return, and admitted that she would need time and practice to learn how to communicate her own needs effectively, having spent so many years focused on anticipating and meeting everyone else's requirements. She expressed particular concern about maintaining her effectiveness in her royal duties while also allowing herself to be more emotionally open and vulnerable. Catherine reassured both siblings that emotional authenticity would ultimately make them better at their royal roles rather than undermining their effectiveness. She pointed out that people responded positively to genuine connection and that Anne's work was so impactful precisely because it came from a place of authentic care and commitment. Learning to accept support and express vulnerability wouldn't diminish that authenticity. It would enhance it by making it more sustainable. As their time together drew toward a close, each of them reflected on how profoundly the afternoon had changed their understanding of their relationships and themselves. Charles felt lighter somehow, as if acknowledging the depth of his love and gratitude for her and had freed him from the burden of taking her support for granted. He could envision family gatherings that felt genuinely nurturing rather than simply obligatory, conversations that strengthened their bonds rather than simply maintaining formal connections, and experienced a mixture of exhaustion and hope, drained by the emotional intensity of finally expressing feelings she had kept hidden for decades, but also energized by the possibility of relationships that included space for her own needs and vulnerabilities. The prospect of being truly known and accepted by her family members, rather than simply appreciated for her usefulness, felt both terrifying and wonderful. Catherine felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that her instinct to facilitate this conversation had been correct, that sometimes families needed an outside voice to help them recognize and express the love that had always existed but had been constrained by circumstances and learned patterns. She was also aware of the ongoing responsibility this created for her, the need to continue supporting and encouraging this new dynamic as it developed over time. The storm outside had completely passed, leaving behind a clear evening sky dotted with the first stars of twilight. Inside Windsor Castle, three people prepared to rejoin the formal world of royal duties and public obligations, but they carried with them a new understanding that would influence every interaction going forward. The whispered words that had broken down Anne's defenses had also opened up possibilities for connection and healing that none of them had dared to imagine before.